Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has been on a diplomatic comeback tour this year, rebuilding ties with many of the Arab neighbors who had previously shunned the dictator over his criminal civil war tactics. After more than a decade of isolation and sanctions, Assad has managed to regain his seat at the Arab League, a regional organization that suspended Syria in 2011 over its brutal crackdown on anti-government protesters. In May 2023, Assad attended the Arab League summit in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, for the first time since the war began, receiving a warm welcome from King Salman and other Arab leaders. The Saudi-Syrian rapprochement was a major breakthrough for Assad, who had lost the support of one of the most influential and wealthy Sunni powers in the region. Saudi Arabia had long backed rebel groups opposed to Assad's regime, hoping to weaken Iran's influence and prevent the spread of Shia militias in Syria. But after years of stalemate and frustration, Riyadh changed its strategy and decided to engage with Damascus instead of trying to overthrow it. The reasons behind this shift were manifold. Saudi Arabia wanted to contain the humanitarian crisis in Syria, which had created millions of refugees and displaced people, many of whom sought shelter in neighboring countries. It also wanted to curb the drug trafficking networks that had emerged from the chaos of war, posing a threat to Saudi's security and stability. Moreover, Saudi Arabia saw an opportunity to counter Turkey's growing role and ambitions in Syria, especially in the north where Ankara had established a military presence and supported various factions. But perhaps the most important factor that pushed Saudi Arabia to reconcile with Assad was its desire to improve its relations with Iran, its regional rival and nemesis. In March 2023, Riyadh and Tehran reached a diplomatic deal that ended their proxy wars in Yemen and Iraq, and opened channels for dialogue and cooperation on other issues. As part of this deal, Saudi Arabia agreed to respect Iran's interests and allies in Syria, while Iran agreed to restrain its militias and limit its interference. This diplomatic breakthrough paved the way for other Arab states to follow suit and normalize their ties with Assad. The United Arab Emirates, which had reopened its embassy in Damascus in 2018, invited Assad to attend the COP28 UN conference on climate change in Dubai in December 2023, where he could potentially meet with Western leaders who had once called for his removal. Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, and Jordan also restored their diplomatic relations with Syria, signaling their acceptance of Assad's survival and legitimacy. The Arab world's embrace of Assad was a major setback for the United States and its European allies, who had imposed harsh sanctions on Syria under the Caesar Act, hoping to pressure Assad into political reforms and accountability for his war crimes. The U.S. Congress even passed a new bill in May 2023 that banned any future administration from recognizing Assad's government and tightened the sanctions regime. But these measures failed to achieve their goals, as Assad showed no signs of compromise or remorse. Instead, Assad relied on his allies Russia and Iran to help him weather the economic crisis and maintain his grip on power. He also exploited the divisions and weaknesses of his opponents, both inside and outside Syria. He crushed the remaining pockets of resistance in Idlib and Dara provinces with Russian air support. He co-opted some Kurdish groups that had been abandoned by the US after its withdrawal from Syria. He ignored the demands of the UN-sponsored peace process that called for a new constitution and free elections. By 2023, Assad had effectively won the war in Syria, at least militarily. He had regained control over most of the territory and population. He had secured his position as the undisputed leader of Syria for the foreseeable future. And he had restored his relations with many of his Arab neighbors who had once tried to topple him. He had achieved all this despite his brutal repression of his own people, his use of chemical weapons, his torture of thousands of detainees, and his responsibility for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Assad's diplomatic comeback exposed the failure of Western policy in Syria. It also revealed the limits of moral outrage and humanitarian intervention in a complex and ruthless regional conflict. It demonstrated how realpolitik and pragmatism prevailed over ideals and principles in shaping the outcomes of war and peace. And it showed how a ruthless dictator could survive against all odds and defy all expectations. One of the most significant developments in Syria's diplomatic comeback is the restoration of its membership in the Arab League, the regional organization that represents 22 Arab countries. Syria was suspended from the League in 2011, after the Syrian government's violent suppression of peaceful protests sparked a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions more. For more than a decade, Syria was isolated and shunned by most of its Arab neighbors, who supported various opposition groups and imposed sanctions on Damascus. But in a dramatic policy shift, the Arab League decided to fully reinstate Syria's membership earlier this month, following intensive negotiations and mediation efforts by several Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq. The League's Secretary General, Ahmed Abul-Gheit, welcomed Syria back into the bloc on May 17, as Arab foreign ministers gathered for a preparatory meeting ahead of the full summit in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.